case, I call Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the point of order. The Honourable Nick Smith.
I apologise to the Russell Norman. I seek leave of the House to table a document covering the last 20 budgets prepared by Grant Leland from the Parliamentary Library.
That you referred to earlier. As referred to in leave is sought for.
No, it's not.
The members indicated that it's been constructed from the Parliamentary Library. It's not publicly available, and leave is sought for the purpose of tabling that. Is there any objection? Yes. There is objection. It won't be tabled. I call Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the budget. Before I begin, I'd just like to say to National Party members and Labor Party members that the jokes about gender reassignment surgery are pretty disgusting and they're ugly, and I think they should stop. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start by acknowledging the positive benefit, the positive dimensions of the budget, and I'd like to identify 4 particular parts of it. The first is around the benefit increases above inflation. I think they're important. I think they're real. There's no question that it's not enough. There's no question that it has been abated and partially taken back. And the changes forcing parents to go to work when their children are only 3 are appalling. But it's also true that the benefit increases are good, and breaking the ground and saying that benefits should increase ahead of inflation because of the terrible poverty in our country, I think is a good thing. And I acknowledge the work of Child Poverty Action Group and all those who have campaigned on poverty for so many years. The second area I'd like to acknowledge is on the capital gains tax and the introduction of a capital gains tax and the foreign buyers tax identity changes. These are the change in the introduction of a capital gains tax, I think, is a very positive move. Obviously, the 2 years is too short, and the other limitations around it. I'd particularly like to congratulate David Cunliffe and David Parker, who provided, along with the Green Party, the momentum to actually get a capital gains tax introduced, and over time it will be regularised and made more sensible, as it should be. And I think those 2 initiatives, the increasing the benefits and the capital gains tax, the Green Party has also campaigned on for many years, and we're very pleased to see as limited as they are. Thirdly, I'd like to identify the user pays airport charges. I think they're important. Biosecurity is an important issue for New Zealand. This is a good way to fund it. And fourthly, I'd like to congratulate National on abandoning the fetish around the surplus that characterised their election campaign. It was always ridiculous the way that National characterised the surplus as the defining feature of prudent economic management, and I think Bill English has now acknowledged that. I wish he had have done so during the election campaign. Mr. Speaker, aside from the good elements of the budget, and there are some, there are unfortunately many other elements of the budget which are quite bad. Let me start with climate change. We now have about 421 billion tonnes of ice being lost each year from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets as a result of climate change. So we're losing about 421 billion tonnes as the planet warms. The South Antarctic Peninsula ice sheet is starting to break up. This is one of the greatest challenges. It is the greatest challenge facing humanity on the face of the planet right now, and unfortunately this government is accelerating New Zealand's emissions rather than cutting them. When we look at an economy like New Zealand, which is dependent on a stable climate, when we look at the floods in Wellington, the drought in Canterbury, the 2013 drought which had such a big impact on New Zealand should be at the forefront of taking action to reduce emissions and take action on climate change, because an economy like ours is particularly susceptible to extreme weather events like floods and droughts and the changes that are coming our way as a result of our increased greenhouse gas emissions globally. But when we look at what New Zealand is actually doing, it is actually shameful. So New Zealand's gross emissions have increased 20% from 1990 to 2013. New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions have increased by 42% from 1990 to 2013. I think it's worth dwelling on how amazingly irresponsible we have been as a country. Increasing our net emissions by 42% from 1990 to 2013 is an incredibly irresponsible thing to do. And there's no getting away from that. The Ministry for the Environment have produced forward projections which say that New Zealand plans to increase its net emissions by a further 50% in the next 10 years. So not only have we increased our net emissions by 42% over this period, but looking forward, Ministry for the Environment projections say New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions will increase by a further 50% in just one decade. That is an incredibly grossly irresponsible thing to do, and generations of the future will curse us for it, as they rightly should. The reason why these emissions are increasing is because we have policy settings designed to increase emissions. Since this government's got into office, it has gutted the emissions trading scheme, which was meant to put a price on greenhouse emissions in order to be an effective economic instrument to drive down greenhouse emissions. Every economic report that you read tells you very clearly the most effective way is to put a price on emissions that has an effect right across an economy and that reduces emissions. Unfortunately, when the government got in, it gutted the key elements of the ETS. We now have the ETS as a major liability on the New Zealand government. So it's projected in the government papers that the cost of the emissions trading scheme, because the subsidies to pollution now are so large, that the cost of the government is $684 million of taxpayer spending over 2 years. So we plan to subsidise greenhouse pollution via the ETS, the system that's supposed to cut pollution. We're subsidising it to the tune of $684 million in just 2 years. That's the subsidy that taxpayers are giving to climate polluters in New Zealand. The subsidy since the scheme started now totals $859 million of taxpayer money has been given to polluters via the emissions trading scheme. That is not a scheme designed to cut emissions, that's a scheme designed to increase emissions. Treasury has tried to estimate what will be the cost to the New Zealand public of the failure to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Their estimate is that our failure to cut greenhouse gas emissions means that we're going to have to buy carbon credits offshore. Depending on the cost of those carbon credits, Treasury say it could cost us up to $52 billion to buy offshore carbon credits to cover the big increase in emissions coming out of the New Zealand economy, because all the policy settings are set up to increase emissions. So we're going to have to buy carbon credits offshore. Treasury says it could cost up to $52 billion of taxpayer money to buy those offshore carbon credits, because we've increased our emissions so radically over this period. So do we really want to spend $52 billion buying offshore carbon credits, maybe worthless, but kind of, they make the grade for accounting purposes, or would we rather spend that money in New Zealand reducing our own emissions? Now, the government's answer to that is very clear. It would prefer to buy offshore carbon credits because its plan is to increase emissions. I think that is incredibly irresponsible and stupid. It's hard to really characterise how stupid it is for a government to have a whole bunch of policy settings to increase emissions and then spend $50 billion to buy worthless hot air offshore. That is an amazingly short-sighted and stupid policy. Now, the thing is it's not just the ETS. Of course, there are subsidies in many sectors in New Zealand to increase emissions. Just think of the dairy sector. If you're in the dairy sector, you do not pay for your methane emissions. You do not pay for your nitrous oxide emissions. The taxpayer covers the cost of those for you. They're free to the dairy sector. Plus, you get free fresh water. You don't have to pay any charge for the water. You get free water pollution. There's no charge when you pollute a stream. You don't have to pay anything to dispose of that polluted water. And as the government crowed about in question time today, there are very large subsidies to expand the dairy sector, the irrigation subsidies, $400 million of subsidies directly into the dairy sector in order to expand it so its emissions will increase, water quality will decline. It's an amazingly short-sighted policy to spend that much money to increase pollution. And then, of course, beyond that, we have the poor old forestry sector. The forestry sector, which actually reduces our net emissions, it sequesters carbon. They, of course, because the price of carbon emissions is so low in New Zealand now, that the forestry sector is cutting down a larger area of land than it is replanting. So out of the forestry sector, it is a net emitter out of New Zealand as a result of the government's policies. Then we have the subsidies for road freight and road transport. Literally tens of billions of dollars are given to motorways, to the road freight companies for free, so that we can increase emissions coming out of the roading sector. Then we have the subsidies for fossil fuel exploration. The government is very keen and very proud of the high level of subsidy it provides to oil exploration companies in order to look for fossil fuels. So we're subsidising that as well. Is it any wonder that Fonterra is literally building coal-fired boilers right now at the 21st century when we should be cutting emissions? The Fonterra, who doesn't seem to care in the slightest about its global brand, is building coal-fired boilers in New Zealand. Is it any wonder that the rail network is talking about removing electrification from the main trunk line? Could anything signify how backward and mid-20th century we have become when the rail industry is not talking about electrifying the rail network, it's talking about de-electrifying the rail network in New Zealand at the beginning of the 21st century. We are so out of the loop as to what is going on in the world in terms of the smart green economic revolution that is taking the whole rest of the world by storm. And in New Zealand, we are determined to drive back to the mid-20th century. We're going to have coal, we're going to have motorways, we're going to subsidise oil exploration, we're going to get rid of electrification on rail because, oh, who wants that electrification stuff? That is the reality of where climate policy has got to in our country. And it is a total disaster. New Zealand can embrace the smart green economic revolution. We can be part of this global change. We can do the right thing by our kids, but we need the government to change direction.
I call Tracy Martin.